January 17, 1945. Hatton, Alsace-Lorraine. The frozen mud cracked beneath the treads. Snow fell in silent curtains across the shattered village square, blanketing the rubble of what had once been a bakery, a chapel, a home. The air smelled of cordite and pine resin, and beneath it all, something older earth turned inside out by shellfire. In the cellar of a half-collapsed stone farmhouse, Oberleutnant Klaus Zimmermann pressed his back against the cold wall and listened. The sound was wrong. Not the familiar growl of a Sherman tank. Something deeper. Something that made the bottles on the shelf rattle in their dust. Then he saw it. Through the narrow cellar window, framed by splintered wood and January gray, came a shape that defied his 3 years of training. A tank, yes, but one that breathed. From its hull jutted a long mechanical snout, and from that snout erupted a stream of liquid fire that arced across the street like a dragon's tongue, clinging to stone, to wood, to snow itself, turning winter into hell. The flame was orange at its core, yellow at its edges and where it touched. The world disappeared into black, smoke and screaming heat. Zimmermann had fought at Kursk. He had survived the hedgerows of Normandy. He had seen men torn apart by artillery, frozen solid in foxholes, burned alive in tiger tanks when the ammunition cooked off. But this was something else. This was fire with intention. Fire with a crew. Fire with a postal code and a manufacturing number. He turned to his radio man, a boy from Leipzig who still had acne on his chin, and said 6 words that would later appear in American after-action reports, translated from the intercepted German transmission. "That she can see Mitch. Statison. Please shoot me instead." The M4 Sherman, equipped with the E45 flamethrower, system designated by American crews as the Zippo, or Satan's blowtorch, was not the first flamethrower tank in history. The British had experimented with flame projectors mounted on armored vehicles. As early as 1918, the Germans themselves had deployed the Flampanzer, 3 against Soviet positions in 1943. But what rolled into Alsace-Lorraine in the winter of 1945 was different, not in kind, but in scale, in doctrine, and in the sheer industrial certainty behind it. Each M4A3 flamethrower variant carried 290 gallons of thickened fuel, a napalm mixture of gasoline and a gelling agent that turned liquid fire into something sticky, something that clung and burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The flamethrower replaced the bow machine gun, and its range extended to 150 yards under optimal conditions. But range was not the weapon's true terror. Its terror was psychological. It was ontological. It announced with every burst that the laws of modern warfare, distance, cover, concealment, no longer applied. German soldiers had been trained to fear many things: the Soviet Katyusha rocket barrage, the Allied air superiority that turned roads into graveyards, the relentless arithmetic of American logistics, the convoys that never stopped coming. But fire was primal. Fire bypassed reason. Fire reached into the part of the brain that still remembered the savannah, the cave, the night predator circling beyond the light, and the Americans who had more of everything, who arrived with chocolate bars and cigarettes, and tanks that outnumbered the Wehrmacht's remaining armor by ratios that would have embarrassed Hannibal had weaponized fire itself. The Wehrmacht officer corps of 1945 was not the same institution that had rolled through Poland in 1939. 6 years of total war had gutted its aristocratic pretensions, its meticulous staff college doctrine, its belief in the supremacy of the offensive. What remained were men who had learned to read the grammar of defeat in the way snow fell on a trench line, in the silence after a radio call went unanswered, in the smell of a field kitchen that had no food. They had adapted to many horrors. They had learned to fight without air cover, without fuel, without hope. They had become experts in retreat, in defensive hedgehog positions, in the elastic defense that traded space for time. But adaptation requires pattern recognition. It requires the ability to calculate odds, to weigh risk against gain, to find the narrow path between annihilation and survival. The Flamethrower tank offered no such path. Captured German documents. From the Colmar Pocket. Operation now archived in the U.S. National Archives reveal a recurring theme in officer reports and prisoner interrogations. The language is clinical, even in translation, but beneath the military jargon lies something rawer. One report from the 10th SS Panzer Division describes an engagement near Jebsheim. On January 27, 1945, enemy employed flame projector tanks against company positions in village center. Defensive fire ineffective due to psychological impact on personnel. Casualties light from direct flame contact. Casualties heavy from personnel abandoning defensive positions under panic. Morale effect catastrophic. Recommend immediate withdrawal from any sector where such weapons are deployed. Morale effect catastrophic. The German military did not use such language lightly. This was an army that had coined terms like Kessel Schlecht cauldron battle to describe encirclements where entire divisions were ground to dust. An army that had fought at Stalingrad until men were eating the glue from their boots. Yet here, in the frozen villages of Alsace, officers were recommending withdrawal not because the Flamethrower tanks were tactically unstoppable. A well-placed Panzerfaust could destroy one as easily as any Sherman, but because their presence shattered the psychological contract that allowed men to fight at all. What the German soldiers expected in those early weeks of 1945 was a certain kind of death. They expected artillery. The Americans had artillery in quantities that seemed to violate the laws of physics, entire grid squares erased by timed barrages, coordinates called in by forward observers with radios that actually worked. They expected airstrikes. The P-47 Thunderbolts that came in low over the treetops, their wing-mounted rockets turning a half-track into a funeral pyre before the driver even heard the engine roar. They expected tanks. Shermans in 3s and 4s, working with infantry, methodical and relentless. The way a factory floor is relentless. These were industrial deaths. Impersonal deaths. The kind of deaths that a soldier could rationalize, could fit into the narrative of modern war. You took cover. You fired back. You hoped your side's artillery was better, your side's air force larger, your side's logistics less catastrophic. And if you died quickly. Your body left as evidence that you had participated in something bigger than yourself. Something that history books would explain with arrows on maps. The Flamethrower tank offered a different contract. It offered fire that sought you out in your hiding place. Fire that poured through windows and doorways and ventilation slits. That turned a cellar into an oven. That consumed not just your body, but the air your body needed to scream. It offered a death that was visceral, visible, that reduced you to carbon and ash while your comrades watched from 50 yards away, unable to help, unable to look away, and perhaps worst of all, it offered time. 3, 4, sometimes 5 seconds of burning before unconsciousness. An eternity measured in nerve endings. Sergeant Robert Stubby Carlson, gunner on an M4 Flamethrower tank with the 70th Tank Battalion, recorded his memories in a 1983 oral history interview with the Library of Congress, Veterans History Project. You'd see them come out of the buildings before we even fired. Just the sight of the tank would do it. They'd come out with their hands up, sometimes crying, sometimes just blank. One guy officer, I think, had the uniform. He kept pointing at us, and then at his sidearm. Kept making this gesture, like he wanted us to shoot him with bullets instead. Our TC told him to drop the pistol and get in line with the others. But the look on his face, I still see it sometimes. The transformation occurred not in a single moment, but in a cascading series of realizations. First, that American industrial capacity was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. That a nation which could produce 290 gallons of napalm per tank, which could manufacture the precision nozzles and pressure systems required to project that napalm 150 yards, which could then deploy dozens of these tanks to a single core sector such a nation operated on principles that transcended traditional military calculation. Second, that American doctrine reflected a fundamentally different relationship to violence. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on the Begegungskrieg, the war of movement, of Schwerpunkt and penetration, of the elegant operational maneuver. Even in defeat, there was pride in the execution, in the staff work, in the concept. The Americans seemed to care nothing for elegance. They cared about results. If fire worked better than bullets, use fire. If using fire meant the enemy surrendered faster, saving American lives, then fire was not merely a weapon, but a moral choice. Third, that the psychological dimension of warfare, which the Germans had themselves exploited with the Stuka dive bomber siren, with the Blitzkrieg speed, with the SS's cultivated reputation for ruthlessness, could be turned into a systematic tool of disintegration. The flamethrower tank did not need to kill many soldiers to be effective. It needed only to be seen, to be possible, to lurk in the imagination of every man crouched in every cellar from Colmar to the Rhine. By February 1945, German tactical doctrine in the Western theater had been rewritten around a single principle: avoid close-quarters combat in built-up areas where American flamethrower tanks could be employed. Intelligence summaries circulated through division headquarters contained warnings that read less like military assessments and more like exorcisms. Rituals designed to ward off a force that operated outside the normal rules, but there was nowhere left to retreat. The Rhine was at their backs. The Americans were in front, and behind the Americans came more Americans. And behind them came the supply trucks, the fuel tankers, the Liberty ships unloading in Antwerp and Marseille, the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh still running 3 shifts, still pouring out the material excess of a nation that had never known siege, never known starvation, never known what it meant to run out. The recurring symbol, present in nearly every first-hand account from both sides, was the smell, not the smell of the fire itself that was acrid, chemical, the reek of petroleum and burning gelatin. But what came after? The smell of a village that had been cleansed by flame, where every wooden beam and thatched roof and curtain had been reduced to a uniform gray ash, where the snow itself seemed scorched. German soldiers who surrendered to units employing flamethrower tanks often carried with them, according to MP's reports, small sachets of tobacco or sprigs of pine needles pressed against their noses. Anything to block the smell. Anything to avoid breathing in the evidence of what American abundance could create, because that was the deeper terror, not the weapon itself, but what the weapon represented. The German war machine in 1945 was a scavenger. It ran on synthetic oil because the Romanian fields were lost. It fielded Volkssturm units armed with single-shot rifles because the factories were rubble. It moved infantry by bicycle and horse-drawn cart because there was no fuel for trucks. Every bullet was counted. Every shell was precious. Every Tiger tank that broke down was cannibalized for parts because there would be no replacements. And into this landscape of scarcity came the Americans with their tank that existed only to burn, not to destroy a bunker, though it could, not to neutralize a strongpoint, though it did, but to project fire as a statement of surplus. To say, we have so much fuel, such robust logistics, such deep reserves, that we can afford to pump 290 gallons of thickened gasoline through a pressurized nozzle for the sole purpose of making you afraid. The M4 flamethrower tank was not, in the end, a weapon of necessity. The Americans had plenty of weapons of necessity. They had the 155mm howitzer that could level a building from 3 miles away. They had the P-51 Mustang that owned the sky. They had the rifle squad with the M1 Garand, 8 rounds of semi-automatic certainty. The flamethrower tank was a weapon of choice, a deliberate escalation, a tool selected from a vast menu of destruction because someone in the Ordnance Department and someone in the War Department and someone in the chain of command that stretched back across the Atlantic to a nation eating steak and listening to Bing Crosby on the radio had decided that fire would save American lives by breaking German will, and it did. Historical record is unambiguous. The casualty reports, the prisoner interrogation transcripts, the operational summaries all point to the same conclusion. The psychological impact of flamethrower tanks was disproportionate to their actual tactical employment. The 70th Tank Battalion, which fielded one of the highest concentrations of flamethrower-equipped Shermans in the European theater, recorded direct flame kills in the low dozens across the entire Alsace campaign. But that same battalion's after-action reports credit the flame tank threat with inducing the surrender of an estimated 400 to 600 Wehrmacht personnel who abandoned, prepared positions rather than face potential immolation. A German major captured near Nervbrisach in February 1945 told his interrogators, and the transcript survives in the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth, that we were told to hold the village for 72 hours. We had adequate ammunition, good fields of fire, veterans from the Asphalt who knew how to fight from ruins. Then we received reports that American flame tanks were moving up the valley. My company commanders came to me, one by one, not to say they couldn't hold, to ask permission to withdraw before the flames arrived. I radioed division. I was told to hold. I radioed again and asked what we should do if the flame tanks attacked. There was a long silence. Then the response, "Use your judgment." That is when I knew the war was over. When your own headquarters tells you to use your judgment, it means they have none left to give. Use your judgment. The phrase appears again and again in the German records of this period. A bureaucratic white flag. An admission that the structures of command and doctrine and rational planning had collapsed under the weight of material reality. There is a photograph, not widely circulated, held in the Eisenhower Presidential Library's archives, taken by a Signal Corps cameraman on February 4, 1945. It shows a stretch of road outside the village of Ostheim. The road is lined with German prisoners, perhaps 60 men, sitting in the snow with their hands on their heads. In the background, slightly out of focus, is an M4 Sherman. The flame projector is visible, a dark tube extending from the bow, still dripping. What makes the photograph remarkable is not the composition or the historical significance. It is the faces. Even in the grainy black and white, even across 8 decades, the expressions are readable. These are not men who have been defeated by superior tactics or braver soldiers. These are men who have encountered something outside their prepared categories of experience. They look less like prisoners of war than like survivors of a natural disaster. Shock without comprehension. Relief without pride. One man, front row, left side, is staring directly at the camera. His mouth is slightly open. His eyes are focused but empty. On his collar, the Litzen insignia of an officer. On his face, the understanding that the ideology he had served, the ideology of will, of discipline, of the Bermensch who could endure what others could not, had been rendered obsolete by a nation that fought not with will but with wealth, not with sacrifice but with surplus. The epilogue to this story is not written in the archives or the after-action reports. It is written in the silence that followed the surrender, when Germany capitulated in May 1945. Among the many provisions of the occupation was the complete disarmament and demilitarization of the German state. Flamethrowers, as a category of weapon, were subject to special restrictions under international law going back to the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Yet it is telling that the American military continued to develop and deploy flame weapons in the Pacific Theater, in Korea, in Vietnam, while the reconstructed German military forces of NATO did not. The lesson had been learned too well. Fire, as a weapon, is uncontrollable in ways that bullets and shells are not. Fire spreads. Fire consumes indiscriminately. Fire transforms the landscape itself into an enemy. But more than that, fire reveals. It reveals who has the resources to burn and who has only the resources to flee. It reveals who can afford to wage war with abundance and who must ration even their violence. The flamethrower tank was never the deadliest weapon on the Western Front. That distinction belongs to artillery, or perhaps to simple exposure and disease. It was never the most technically sophisticated. The proximity fuse and the radar-guided anti-aircraft gun were marvels of engineering that the flame projector could not match, but it was perhaps the most honest weapon. Honest about the nature of the conflict. Honest about the asymmetry. Honest about the fact that industrial democracy, when roused to total war, does not fight for survival, it fights for the right to dictate terms. The German officers who said, "Please shoot me instead," were not asking for mercy. They were asking for a return to the old rules. The rules where violence was rationed, where death came from a distance, where a soldier could maintain the fiction that he was a warrior rather than a target in an industrial process. That the flamethrower tank said, no doubt it said, "You are in a war of production, and we have outproduced you. You are in a war of resources, and we have resources you cannot imagine. You are in a war of will, and we do not need will, we have supply chains." The flame itself was just chemistry. Napalm was just gasoline and aluminum salts. The tank was just a Sherman with a modified bowgun. But the meaning of the weapon, the symbolic weight it carried, was the entire economic might of a continent that had never been bombed, never been starved, never been forced to choose between bullets and bread. In the end, that was what broke them. Not the fire. The knowledge that the fire was inexhaustible. That behind every flamethrower tank was another, and behind that was a factory. And behind the factory was a nation that could afford to burn. Oberleutnant Klaus Zimmermann survived the war. His name appears in the prisoner of war records at Camp Concordia, Kansas, where he arrived in March 1945. He worked in the camp kitchen. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He died in 1992 in Heidelberg. Owner of a small printing business, husband, father. A man who never spoke publicly about his service except once. In a letter to an American historian researching the Alsace campaign. In that letter, preserved in the files of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, he wrote, "You ask what I remember most from the war. Not the cold, though I remember being cold. Not the hunger, though I remember being hungry. I remember the moment I understood that we had been defeated not by men, but by a system. A system so vast that it could afford to waste, and in that waste was its victory. We could not waste anything. We fought with empty stomachs and bicycles, and the belief that our suffering made us strong. They fought with full bellies and trucks, and the certainty that their abundance made them unstoppable. The flame tank was not a weapon. It was a message, and we received it. The message endures. In the ash fields of Alsace, in the archives of a dozen nations, in the memory of men who saw fire pour from steel and understood finally that they were not fighting for victory, but bearing witness to its absence. Fire is ancient. Fire is primal. But fire, in the hands of industrial America, became something new, not a force of nature, but a product, manufactured, distributed, deployed, as reliable as a postal service, as certain as a factory whistle. And in that certainty was terror beyond the flame itself, the terror of facing an opponent who had weaponized not merely chemistry or machinery, but the very concept of more. Always more tanks, more fuel, more fire. More than you could ever answer, more than you could ever survive, more than you could do anything but surrender to. Ashes in your mouth, winter at your back, and the smell of abundance burning everything you thought you knew about war.